Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to look at my video. Hope you're having a great day wherever you are. We're going to be taking Pro Strategy Football 2023, which just came out a few weeks ago on Steam, and we're going to play the 1970 NFL season. The reason why we're going with 1970 is pretty simple. It was a season where the two leagues, the National Football League and the American Football League, merged and became one league to avoid the spiraling salaries and competition for talent. They decided that it was in their best interest to merge the two leagues together. Out of that came two conferences, the AFC, the American Football Conference, which was made up of the AFL teams, and the NFC, the National Football Conference, which was made up primarily of the NFL teams, with the exception of a few like Baltimore that moved into the AFC to balance things out from a conference perspective. So we will kick off the season here. So we'll resume that. So looking at the 1970 season in this first video, what I'm going to do is go through each team, kind of highlight some of their key players, and then I will sim it week to week, and we can watch the highlights. So we'll have like a halftime highlight kind of montage for each one of the games and reveal the final score at the end. So looking at our week one schedule, we have Miami and Boston, Denver at Buffalo, and you can see has a stadium name, temperature, wind conditions, weather conditions. So as you go through, you'll see those. Oakland is playing Cincinnati. The Jets, the New York Jets, are going to be playing Cleveland. That was, as a matter of fact, the very first Monday night football game in history. So the Jets and the Browns kicked off Monday night football, and that became an institution to this day. We have the Detroit Lions playing the Packers. The Cardinals at the Rams in LA, playing in the Coliseum. Kansas City and Minnesota. This is a interesting game because this is the rematch from the 1969 Super Bowl. So the fourth Super Bowl was played by Kansas City and Minnesota, with Kansas City coming out the winner in that. We have the Falcons in New Orleans. Both of those teams are relatively new in the NFL, expansion teams a few years earlier. You have Chicago playing the New York Football Giants in Yankee Stadium. Yep, the Giants used to play in Yankee Stadium. You'll see some baseball stadiums in here. Chicago, for example, played in Wrigley. So we'll see quite a few of those games played with the baseball diamond out on the field. Dallas is playing the Philadelphia Eagles. Houston is playing Pittsburgh, opening up Three Rivers Stadium. You have the Baltimore Colts, newly of the AFC, playing San Diego. And then Washington playing San Francisco in Old Kezar Stadium, which I believe in a year or two they're going to be moving. The San Francisco 49ers will move into Candlestick Park, which at that time had artificial turf. So we go back, look at the standings. Obviously, no games played, but what we'll do is we'll go through each team. Your Dallas Cowboys of 1970, of course, their opponent in week one will be Philadelphia. And looking at the team depth chart, at quarterback, you have Craig Morton, who started the majority of the games in 1970. If he was ineffective, Tom Landry didn't have any compulsion to pull him and go with Roger Staubach. So Roger did see some starts in that season, but the bulk of those went to Craig Morton. Your halfbacks, Calvin Hill and Walt Garrison. Your fullbacks, Dwayne Thomas, who was a rookie at that time, and then old reliable Dan Reeves, still playing for the Cowboys at that time. Your tight ends, you have Pettis Norman and Mike Ditka. Tom Landry would use Pettis Norman and Mike Ditka and Claxton Welch, but primarily Norman and Ditka, to run in plays. So Pettis Norman and Mike Ditka would rotate through as Landry needed to run plays in for Craig Morton. Your wide receivers, starting wide receiver would be Lance Retzel and Bob Hayes. Your offensive linemen, good offensive line for the Cowboys. You have Neely, Nyland, Manders, Blaine Nye, and Rayfield Wright. Now we move on to the defense, the Doomsday defense, or if you want to call it the Doomsday 1 defense, the original Doomsday defense, would be Larry Cole, Jethro Pugh, the great Bob Lilly, and George Andre. The linebacking core, very solid as well, with Edwards, Howley, and Leroy Jordan. And their defensive backs, that defensive backfield that they had, veteran and super solid, as you can see, with Herb Adderley, the former Packer, Charlie Waters, Cornell Green, and the great Mel Renfro. Your kicker, Mike Clark. Punter is Ron Whidbey. And then your returners are going to be Dwayne Thomas, Margene Atkins. And punt returners, you get the great Bob Hayes, former Olympian. And I think he was considered at one time close to being, if not, the fastest man on the planet. And Mel Renfro. Your New York Football Giants will be playing Chicago at home. Their quarterback, Fran Tarkington. Yes, Fran Tarkington for a few seasons played for the New York Giants. Your halfbacks, the former Brown, Ron Johnson. Your fullbacks, Tucker Frederickson and Joe Morrison. Frederickson was a popular target out of the backfield for Fran Tarkington in 1970. Your tight ends, Bob Tucker is the starter. Wide receivers, you have Don Herman starting at split end, and the great Clifton McNeil at wide receiver. The Giants had a great line, very solid offensive line with Young, Harper, Larson, and Doug Van Horn. You have Rich Buzen as well. Defense. Have a famous name in here. You have Bob Lertzma, Jerry Shea, Jim Knickie, and Freddie Dreyer, who later on became popular as an actor in a TV show called Hunter in the 1980s. The linebacking core, Heck, Hazeltine, and Files. Defensive backs, you have Eaton at left cornerback, the great Spider Lockhart. At free safety, Tom Longo, strong safety, and Willie Williams is your right cornerback. Kicker, Pete Gogolak, the first of the soccer-style kickers to play in professional football. As a matter of fact, you could see him as being the impetus for the two leagues to merge, because they had an unwritten rule where they would not sign each other's players. And George Mara owner of the New York Giants, wanted to make a splash and poached Pete Gogolak from the Buffalo Bills, which set off a battle for talent with both sides trying to sign one another's players, which of course got out of control, and it kind of brought them both to the agreement that, yeah, I think it's best we probably merge the leagues, because there's not going to be any winners in a bidding war, and not only the legal battles over contracts that were signed in this period. So you have Gogolak kicking. Johnson's your punter. Your returners for kickoffs are going to be Les Shy and Bobby Duhan. And your punt returners are Duhan and Spider Lockhart. The Eagles will be hosting Dallas week 1. And the Eagles, this was a team that struggled. You have Norm Snead, the starting quarterback, the veteran. The halfbacks, you have Bogus and Tom Woodenschnick. Their main man in the backfield, however, is going to be Cyril Pinder. Tight ends, you have Gary Ballman and Steve Zabel. Zabel will eventually move to linebacker, believe it or not, from tight end. Your wide receivers, you have Ben Hawkins on one side and the diminutive Harold Jackson at the other side. Offensive line, good, with Keyhart, Evans, and Skaggs and Carollo as your starting line. The defense, and this is where we'll see struggles with the Eagles. You have Callaway, Holtz, Pettigrew, and Tom as your front four. Your linebackers, Young, Porter, and Tim Rosevich. Your defensive backs, Jones, Priest, Ramsey, and Nelson. Mark Mosley is the kicker for the Eagles. Bill Bradley, not to be confused with the professional basketball player of this day. He'll be doing handling the punting duties. Kick returners, Wallach and Nelson. Punt returners, Wallach and Hawkins. The Cardinals. Cardinals were looking to be a competitive team. We'll see how they do in this reenactment and sim of 1970. They are at LA playing in the Coliseum against the Rams in week 1. You have Jimmy Hart as their starting quarterback. Your halfbacks, Johnny Rowland and Sid Edwards. At fullback, you're going to have the great MacArthur Lane, who was a dangerous guy with the ball, either taking a handoff or catching a pass out of the backfield. Your tight ends, Jackie Smith. Fantastic tight end in his day. Your wide receivers, your split end is going to be Dave Williams. Your starting wide receiver is John Gilliam. The offensive line, Reynolds, Good, Mulligan, Williams, and McMillan. Your defensive front four for the Cardinals, Kruger, Heron, Rowe, and Walker. As you can see, that's a tough line. Your linebacking core, Stallings, Parrish, and Rivers are your starting linebackers. In the defensive backfield, you have Miller Farr, the veteran Larry Wilson, Jerry Stovall, and Roger Worley. Doing the kicking, Jim Bakken. Punting, Chuck Latourette, who actually also has kick return duties, along with Charlie Pittman. And, of course, you have Latterette, and Johnny Rowland handling punt returns. The Washington Redskins at San Francisco in week 1. And the Redskins were a team that was struggling. So we'll see if they do better than they did in real life or worse. But this is a team that needed an identity and really struggled in 1970. Your quarterback, the buggy whip armed and rather chubby Sonny Jurgensen. Your halfbacks, Larry Brown, good carrying the ball and coming out of the backfield. Haraway is your fullback. Your tight ends, Jerry Smith, Pat Richter, and Matt Alston. However, Smith, fantastic tight end, no relation to the tight end Jackie Smith of the Cardinals. Wide receivers, you have Walter Roberts at split end and Charlie Taylor, the old veteran who moved from halfback to wide receiver. Your offensive line, Snowden, Shoki, House, Laveg, and Walter Rock. That's a good name for an offensive lineman. Your defensive front 4, Hoffman, Peters, Brundage, and Anderson. Your linebackers, McClinton, Chris Handberger, Marlon McKeever. And your defensive backs for the Washington Redskins, Fisher, Harris, Owens, and Mike Bass. Handling kicking, Kurt Knight. Your punter is Mike Bragg. Your kick returners are Vactor and Harris. And Harris and Roberts handling the punt return duties. So that is your NFC East. The Central Division in the NFC. Chicago, who will be playing the Giants in Yankee Stadium. And your quarterbacks, you have Jack Concannon and Bobby Douglas. Again, this is one of these instances where Concannon got most of the starts, but Douglas would fill in. Douglas was definitely a better runner than he was a passer. Concannon was a better passer than a runner. So these two would start, depending on George Hallis's, if he's still coaching at this time. I had to check on that. But basically, Concannon will get the bulk of the starts, and Douglas will come in when they need to switch up on offense. Your halfbacks, Don Shy is your starter. Ronnie Bull is your starter at fullback. Tight ends for the Bears, Wallace and Cody. And then wide receivers. They actually had a fairly good set of receivers to work with. Farmer, Seymour, Dick Gordon, who was really good in the 70s, especially in 1970s. It's a shame that they didn't have a quarterback that could consistently get the ball to this group. Your offensive linemen, this is one reason why. You have Jackson, Holloway, Highland, Cadile, and Mass. They were pretty average at best on the offensive line. So didn't give Concannon a ton of time to throw. And Bobby Douglas, because he could run the ball, would basically just scramble out and gain yardage. Your defensive line, it's the Bears. So you're expecting you're going to have a tough D, and they sure do. Holloman, Stately, Seals, and Obradovich are your starting front 4 for the Chicago Bears. Linebackers, Buffon, the ex-Packer Leroy Caffey, and the great Dick Butkus in the middle. Defensive backs, McRae, Daniels, Phil Clark, and Joe Taylor are your starting defensive backfield. Mac Percival did the kicking. Bobby Joe Green did the punting. Then you have kick returners Smith and Turner, and then Smith and Cole handling punt return duties. Detroit Lions. Lions will be at Green Bay. And this, I know everybody kind of thinks, gosh, it's the Lions. They've been bad for so long. It's hard to remember when they were good. Well, the Lions in 1970 were a very competitive team. Your starting quarterback, Bill Munson got the majority of the starts. Landry would come in as needed. Your halfbacks, Mel Farr. Great halfback if he could stay healthy. Altie Taylor is your starting fullback. Good, solid fullback that they had at that time. Young, as well as Steve Owens, who would come in as well, but Altie Taylor was the man at fullback for the Lions. Your tight ends, the great Charlie Sanders. And looking at wide receivers, Earl McCulloch and Larry Walton were your starting two, with Chuck Hughes coming in as well. The offensive line for the Detroit Lions. I bet you they wish they had this line today. So you have Scholes, Walton, Flanagan, Gallagher, and Freitas. Your defensive front four for the Lions. Another really, really tough crowd to run against. Mitchell, Alex Karras, Jerry Rush, and Larry Hand. Your linebackers, Newmoff, Walker, and Lucy. And the DBs, this is a solid defensive backfield, starting with Lem Barney, Vaughn, Uyghur, and Dick LeBeau. Kicker was Errol Mann. Punter was Herman Weaver. And your returners, the kicker returners were Bobby Williams and Nick Eddy. Punt returners, the great Len Barney and Nick Eddy. Now we're going to look at the Packers, who are basically going to have Detroit as their opener at home. And you're going to see a lot of famous names here. There were still quite a few players from the Lombardi era that were still playing with the Packers at this time, although they were aging and trying to bring in new younger players. Bart Starr is your starting quarterback. When he would struggle, they'd bring in Don Horn. Your halfback, Donnie Anderson and Jim Grabowski, the Gold Dust twins that were drafted by Lombardi. Your fullbacks, Travis Williams and Dave Hampton. Your tight ends, John Hilton, the rookie Rick McGeorge, and Larry Krause. Your wide receivers, Clancy was your starting split end. Carroll Dale was your starting wide receiver. Dale, again, one of the Lombardi era players that was still around at this time. Looking at the offensive line, you have P, Lewick, Ken Bowman, who replaced was the starting center for the Green Bay Packers for years. Curry, so he's obviously been there a few years at center. The great Gail Gillingham at guard, and then the last player on here, Forrest Gregg, another holdover from the Lombardi years, along with Gillingham and Bowman. Your defensive line, Clarence Williams, Bob Brown, Mike McCoy, and Lionel Aldridge. Linebacking, Jim Carter, Fred Carr, and Ray Nitschke, who is winding down his career at this point. Looking at the defensive backfield, you have Ken Ellis, Willie Wood, still going strong for the Packers, Doug Hart, and Bob Jeter. Your kicker is Dale Livingston. Your punter is Donnie Anderson, the halfback. Your kick returners, Ken Ellis and Larry Krause. And punt returners, Willie Wood and Ken Ellis. We'll see how well the transitioning and rebuilding pack do in our simulation as opposed to real life. They struggled in 1970. And your Minnesota Vikings in their Super Bowl rematch at home with Kansas City. Gary Quazzo is your starting quarterback. If you remember, in 1969, the starting quarterback was Joe Kapp, who led them to the Super Bowl. He left the team after the Super Bowl and was replaced by Gary Quazzo. Halfback, Dave Osborne and Bill Brown will share duties there. Fullbacks, Clint Jones and Oscar Reed will split duties as well. John Beasley is your starting tight end. And wide receivers, talented bunch. Grimm and Lindsey at split end, and Gene Washington and John Henderson at wide receiver. The offensive line, Alderman, Vallone, Mick Tingelhoff, Milt Sunday, and Ron Yari. And here we are with the Purple People Eaters. Carl Eller, Gary Larson, Alan Page, Jim Marshall. What can you say about that defensive front four? That it doesn't really get much better than those guys. Your linebackers, another really, really solid group. Winston Hilgenberg and Lonnie Warwick. In the defensive backfield, you have Bobby Bryant, Paul Krause, Carl Kasulki, and Ed Shorrockman. Charlie West was your nickel. Kickers, well, we have handling the kicking duties, Fred Cox, the inventor of the Nerf football. A little trivia there. Punter is Tom McNeil. Jones and West are your kick returners. West and Grimm are your punt returners. And that wraps up the Central and the NFC. The West. Atlanta will be at New Orleans in Tulane Stadium. Bob Berry is your starting quarterback. Cannonball Butler, great name for a back. He's going to be your starting halfback. Harmon Wages is going to be your fullback, sharing duties with Art Malone. Tight end, Jim Mitchell is your starter. And your wide receiving core, Snyder, Brunson, Flatley, and Cogdill. The offensive line, Schneider, Maurer, Jeff Van Note, and Dick Endrell. I hope I pronounced that right. And George Kuntz is your right tackle. Okay, defense. The great Claude Humphreys at left end. Greg Lenz, Condren, and John Zook. It seemed like every time when I was a kid that I opened up a pack of Topps football cards, John Zook was always in a pack of cards. So he will be starting at defensive right end, and obviously he was a pretty solid player. Your linebackers, Allen Hansen and the great Tommy Nobis. Your defensive backfield, Reeves, McCauley, Levan, Redmond, and Mallory. Handling the kicking duties, Vineyard. Lothridge is doing the punting. Butler and Campbell handling kick returns, and Mallory and McCauley handling punt returns. The Los Angeles Rams will be hosting St. Louis. And this is a team where there were high expectations. It's a good, solid veteran group. They were the favorites probably to win the NFC West at that in 1970. Just when you look at the names on here, it's like, I'd go with that too. Roman Gabriel is your starting quarterback. Ellison and Smith as your halfbacks. Your fullbacks, Les Josephson and Tommy Mason. Billy Truex is your tight end. Pat Curran as well. And then Bob Klein, who is a rookie at this time, becomes a really solid tight end in a few years. Your wide receivers, Tucker, Long, Snow, and Studstill. Jack Snow is the father of former Giants first baseman J.T. Snow. Another bit of trivia there. He was an outstanding wide receiver for the Rams. Offensive line. Wow. Cowan, Mack, Iman, Shabelli, and Brown. That is, just a legendary offensive line. Speaking of legendary, the fearsome foursome. Deacon Jones, Merle Olsen, Teron Talbert, and Coy Bacon. That, as you can see by the stats, that's going to definitely give the Vikings the run for the money when it comes to having the best front four in the NFC. Your linebackers, Jack Pardee, Maxie Baugh, Myron Patios are your starting three. Almost all the teams had a 4-3 defense at this time. So you're only going to see, 3 linebackers and 4 down linemen. You have a young Jack Hacksaw Reynolds as a backup. Defensive backs, super solid here with Williams, Mador, Richie Pettibone, Kerman Alexander, and Jim Nettles would play in the nickel. Handling kicking, David Ray, Pat Studstill as your punter, Hammond and Alexander as your returners for kickoffs, and punt returns, Hammond and Alexander again. So the New Orleans Saints, this is pre-Archie Manning, folks. They will be hosting Atlanta. Their starting quarterback, the roly-poly, tough guy, Billy Kilmer, known for throwing his wobbly passes but getting the job done. He was the starter for the Saints in '70. Barrington was your starting halfback. Your fullbacks, Tony Baker and Elijah Pitts, Pitts being a former Packer. Dave Parks as the starting tight end. And the wide receiving core, really, really solid. Dodge, Shaw, Abramowitz, and Kenny Burrow, who later, he was a great receiver with the Saints, but was traded to the Oilers later and was part of that great Oilers team of the mid and late 70s. Your offensive line, Talbert, Cup, Strum, Williams, and Linden. Your defensive line, and they struggled on defense. Neal, Tillman, Rowe, and Long. Your linebackers, Morgan, Burkett, and Absher. And your defensive backs would be Wyatt, Scarpati, Hollis, Howell, and Navette as your nickel. Doing the kicking, Tom Dempsey, he of the 63-yard field goal, I think the year before, which set an NFL record. Julian Fagan handling the punting, and then your kick returners are going to be Dodd and Ken Burrows. Punt return, Dodd and Lyons. So that is your NFC Western Division. Now moving on to the AFC. The Colts will be at San Diego. And this is a Colts team that is in transition. This is a team that is only just a couple years off of being in the Super Bowl, where they lost against Joe Namath and the Jets. But there's a lot of legendary players still on the Colts as they start to make their transition. But solid team. With Johnny Unitas as a starting quarterback, Earl Morrall would get his time as well if Unitas couldn't get things rolling. Or at 37, Unitas wasn't what he used to be, so at times Earl Morrall would come in. Your halfback, Norm Bulash was your starting halfback. Fullbacks, Maitland and Hill, they would alternate. At tight end, the great John Mackey. Your wide receivers, and this is a deep, as you can tell, wide receiving group with some great veterans and some good young players coming up. So you have Jefferson, Perkins, Eddie Hinton, who was a rookie there, and as you can tell, very, very good. The veteran Jimmy Orr and Jim O'Brien, who also handled the kicking duties. Back in the 70s, unlike today, you had some players that would do double duty as punters and kickers. O'Brien is one of them. We saw Donnie Anderson with the Packers as another. We'll run across a few more as we go through the lineups. Offensive line, pretty solid with Vogel, Wrestler, the former Packer Bill Curry, John Williams, and Dan Sullivan. Your defensive line. This was a tough group. Bubba Smith and his brother Billy Ray, Fred Miller, and Roy Hilton. That's your front four for the Colts defense. The linebacking core. Grant, Ted, the Mad Stork Hendricks, and Mike Curtis, who is kind of a forgotten player, but during the 70s and in the late 60s, phenomenally talented middle linebacker. He doesn't get his due. He should probably be in the Hall of Fame. That's just my opinion. He was at one time considered the meanest man in football. Just a real tough, hard-nosed linebacker. Defensive backfield, you have Stukes, Volk, Logan, Maxwell. Your kicker is Jim O'Brien. As I mentioned before, the wide receiver Jim O'Brien handled kicking duties. David Lee is your punter. Your kick returners, Jim Duncan and Ron Garden. Quick story, when I was visiting relatives down in Arizona, had to take a shuttle bus up to Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport to fly back home, which is in Minnesota. And while I was waiting for the shuttle to turn up, I ended up having a conversation with a gentleman who turned out to be Ron Garden, and wonderfully nice guy. Told me some great stories about the Colts teams, and actually got a picture of his Super Bowl ring. He was wearing his Super Bowl ring from 1970, where the Colts eventually went to the Super Bowl and won against the Dallas Cowboys. So that was just a great time to just have a conversation with a guy that played in the Super Bowl and was still wearing the ring and played with a lot of legendary players on this team. Garden on handling punt return duties with Rick Volk. Your Boston Patriots will be hosting Miami. And this, if the Patriots in the modern era, in the 2000s and 2010s, and now here in the 2020s ish, were either a dominant team or a very competitive team, the Patriots of the early 70s were the complete opposite. And boy, they struggled badly. So looking at their depth chart, the aforementioned Joe Kapp, who left Minnesota and ended up signing what would be his last go-round in the NFL with the Boston Patriots. Carl Garrett was your starting halfback. He was the last AFL Rookie of the Year before the merger. Your fullback, Jim Nantz, big guy. Trying to think of a modern player that would be close, kind of like a kind of Allstott or Gerald Johnston, just a big, hulking fullback who in the AFL was a real quality runner. At this point, he's got some miles on him and he's kind of winding down his career, but still very effective. Barry Brown is your starting tight end. Your wide receivers, Turner and Sellers were the standouts. The rest of them were okay. Sellers would later go on to have a career with the Dallas Cowboys. The offensive line, Funchess, Montler, Morris, St. Jean, and Neville. And yeah, not a strong blocking group. I think Joe Kapp could attest to that. He was pummeled in 1970. Part of it was for his own hard-nosed playing style as a quarterback. The other one was he was running for his life a lot. Defensive line, Witt, Hunt, Berger, and Antwine. Linebackers, Philpott, Bramlett, Chazinski, and yes, Marty Schottenheimer, former coach of several teams in the NFL. He originally started out with the Buffalo Bills and was wrapping up here with the Boston Patriots. Defensive backs, Carwell, Webb, Scott, Johnson. Your kicker, Gino Cappelletti, who at one time was a double duty player. He would play wide receiver and kick during his days in the AFL and is the AFL's leading scorer. Should be in the Hall of Fame. Punter, Janik. Your returners are going to be Lawson and Garrett. And then Garrett and Blanks are handling the punt return duties. Buffalo. Buffalo is going to be hosting Denver in week 1. So looking at the Bills, Bills could be considered an up-and-coming team, but aren't quite there yet. You have Dennis Shaw, who I believe was Rookie of the Year previous. No, I think he might have been Rookie of the Year in 70. but don't quote me on that. But he was considered a up-and-coming rookie quarterback. His backup was James Harris. Halfbacks, the Juice. O.J. Simpson was their starting halfback. And their number one draft pick, I believe, the year prior. Fullbacks, Patrick and Pate. Tight end, Austin Denny is going to be your starter and rotate with Great. Wide receivers, you have Haven Moses and Marlon Briscoe. Marlon the Magician, who has the notoriety of being the first African-American to start at quarterback with a professional football team. He was the starting quarterback for the Denver Broncos during his days in the NFL, and then transitioned over into becoming a very, very good wide receiver for both Buffalo and then later the Miami Dolphins. Your offensive line, Kindig, Cheek, Marshaleski, O'Donnell, and Costa. The defensive line, Ron the Dancing Bear McDowell, Jim Dunaway, Harvey, and Cowlings. Your linebacking core, these guys were hard as nails linebackers. Guidry, Stratton, and Chandler. The defensive backfield, James Richardson, Pitts, Butch Bird, and your kicker and punter. Guthrie did the kicking duties, and Paul McGuire, who I believe went on to become a sportscaster for one of the major networks as the punter. He used to also do duty as a linebacker. See if they even have him as a linebacker up here. No. So he's a full-time punter by now. Your kick returners, Glenn Alexander and Ike Hill. And punt returners are Farr and Ike Hill. The Miami Dolphins, going to be visiting the Patriots. This is a team that is, as we know, in the early 70s was incredibly dominant, and the only their 72 team went undefeated through regular season and postseason. So this is the start of that great group of players that Don Shula had down in Miami. So you have Bob Greasy as your starting quarterback, Jim Kick and Mercury Morris at halfback, Larry Zonka, the bulldozer, at fullback, Fleming, Seipel, and Mandich as your tight ends. Seipel actually does punting as well. Wide receivers, Twilly and Warfield are your two top guys, with Richardson and Noonan as your backups. The offensive line, Cruson, Williams, DeMarco, the great Larry Little, and Norm Evans, with Kuchenberg as the reserve or backup. Kuchenberg would later, probably after this year, would start for years for the Dolphins. Was just a mainstay on their line. Your defensive linemen, your starting four: Riley, Manny Fernandez, Richardson, and Bill Stanfill. The linebacking core: Swift, Cullen, and Nick Bonacani. One of my favorite players, and was, became famous working with Len Dawson on HBO doing their NFL recap show. Your defensive backs, really, really good. Curtis Johnson, Jake Scott, who also was a fantastic kick and punt returner, Dick Anderson, and Lloyd Mumford. Handling kicking, Garo Yepremian, the little time maker from Cyprus. He actually, at one time prior to playing football, he was a time maker. And, a really good story for a little bald guy from Cyprus that came over and did really well. Had a great career with the Dolphins primarily, but kicked for a few other teams as well. Seipel is your punter. Your returners are going to be, for kick returns, Morris and Herbert Ginn. And again, your punt returners, Jake Scott and Mercury Morris. And Jake Scott was just fantastic in 70 returning punts. And your New York Jets will be playing Monday night, the first Monday night football game at Cleveland Municipal Stadium. Your quarterbacks. You have Al Woodall, who had the majority of the starts over Joe Namath, who was injured again. Joe, I think, started 5 games in this season. Woodall had all the rest. Your halfback, the veteran Emerson Boozer. George Knock was a starting fullback because Matt Snell was injured. He didn't get into as many games as the Jets would like, so that famous backfield of Boozer and Snell weren't together for a good chunk of 1970. Tight ends, Pete Lamons is your starter. Wide receiver, so again, a really, really great group if you can get the ball to him. Veteran George Sauer, little Eddie Bell, the great Don Maynard, and Rich Castor, who as a rookie did a lot of receiving for the Jets and went on to have a career with a couple other teams. Really, really solid player in the 1970s. The offensive line, the great Winston Hill, Rasmussen, Schmidt, Herman, and Foley. The defensive front 4, Jerry Philbin, Mark Lomas, Elliott, and Verlin Biggs, a veteran group with the exception of Lomas. Linebackers, again, solid group. Ralph Baker, Larry Grantham, the original Jet, one of the few original Jets that are still playing for the Jets, I think, at this time. He may be the only one. Back when they were the New York Titans, Grantham played for them. Al Atkinson is your middle linebacker. Your defensive backs, Tannen Hicks, Holloman, Thomas, Hudson playing nickel. Handling kicking, Jim Turner. O'Neill is your punter, and then your kick returners are Battle and McLean, and then Battle and Eddie Bell handle punt return duties. So that wraps up the AFC Eastern Division. The AFC Central, you have the Cincinnati Bengals hosting Oakland. Virgil Carter and Sam Wyche are your quarterbacks. Carter got the majority of the starts. Essex Johnson and Paul Robinson are your halfbacks. Jess Phillips was your starting fullback. Bob Trumpy and Bruce Coslett. Bruce Coslett went on to become a head coach or a coach in the NFL after his playing days. Bob Trumpy became a sports announcer, I believe, for NBC. Wide receivers, Myers, Speedy Thomas. Those are your 2 starters. And you have Crabtree and Lamb as well. Offensive line, Wright, Mays, Bob Johnson, Matson, and Wilson. Your defense, Barry, Mike Reed, Chomzansky, and Ron Carpenter. Your linebacking core, Beaucamp, Avery, and Bill Berge, outstanding linebacker that played for the Bengals for years. The defensive backfield, very solid with Lamar Parrish at cornerback, Ken Riley at the other side. It's two solid young defensive backs that played for Cincinnati for years. Dyer and Smith are your safeties. Kicking, Horst Molman. Dave Lewis is your punter. Parrish and Robinson doing the kick return duties, and Parrish and Johnson handling punt returns. Cleveland. Cleveland's hosting the Jets. Cleveland was one of the teams that came over from the NFL to the AFC. So like the Colts, they took the opportunity to move from the NFC or NFL to the AFC to kind of help balance things out. Let's look at their depth chart. And this is a team that for years had been really competitive and was starting to transition. You're getting some players they're getting much older, and they're trying to mix in some new players. Bill Nelson, the Dr. Bill Nelson, is your starting quarterback. The great Leroy Kelly was the starting halfback. He who replaced Jim Brown. Bo Scott is your fullback. Great fullback. They had a great 1-2 punch with Kelly and Scott. Milt Morin is your starting tight end and would rotate with Glass. And your wide receiving core, Gary Collins at split end. You have, fair hooker. And if you watch some replays of some Monday night games from the early 70s, Don Meredith had a lot of fun with Fair Hooker's name. But Fair Hooker is your starting wide receiver, and as you can tell, he was pretty darn good. Homer Jones backed him up. Offensive line, Shafreth, DeMarie, Hoagland, Hickerson, and Tafoni. That's your starting line. On defense, this is a group that was going through some transition. As you can see, you have some older players and some younger players that are going to be making their way into the lineup. Sindel, Johnson, Jerry Schreck is probably the best player they had on their defensive line. Gregory wasn't very far behind, and they have Turkey Jones that he will be slotting into that starting lineup within a year. The linebacking core, Houston, Andrews, Lindsey, and Bob Matheson fitting in as well. Again, a veteran group that they're kind of on the backside of their career in many ways. The defensive backfield, Barnes, Howell, Kellerman, Sumner, and Summers as your nickel. Don Concroft handled all of the kicking duties for the Browns in 70. Kick return, you had Homer Jones and Reese Morrison and Schoen as handling the punt return duties. Houston, they'll be playing at the new Three Rivers Stadium against the Steelers. And the Oilers, this is going to be a tough season. That's probably putting it mildly. Historically, they were just pretty bad. So you have Charlie Johnson as your starting quarterback, Mike Richardson as your starting halfback, Joe Dawkins, your starting fullback, Alvin Reed, your starting tight end. You have a couple really, really good wide receivers here. Charlie Joyner, who later made his name with the San Diego Chargers during the Eric Coryell years. He's their split end. Jerry Levias. Didn't have a long career, but fantastic receiver, extremely fast. For the time that he did play, he was a really, really solid player. Offensive line, Suggs, Gray, Maples, Durungo, and Hines. Your defensive line, Holmes, Parker, Domrez, and Elvin Bethea, who became a mainstay on that defensive line as well. Great player. The linebacking core. The only guy here, George Webster. Absolutely a beast at left outside linebacker. The rest of these guys, Pritchard, Boyette, they really, outside of Webster, they really struggled at the linebacker position. Defensive backs, Mitchell and Peacock, the great Ken Houston, who also went on to play with the Washington Redskins later in the 70s, and Zeke Moore. Your kicker is Roy Jarella, who, again, became, I would say famous, but he was the kicker for the majority of those great Pittsburgh Steeler teams of the 70s. His fan base was known as Jarella's Gorillas in Three River Stadium. Spike Jones is your punter. Levias and Johnson as your kick returners. And your punt returners, Levias and Richardson. And speaking of Pittsburgh, they're hosting Houston. And this is, you're starting to see the beginnings of that great Steeler team. And they're a draft away from getting a haul of players that are just absolutely going to make a huge difference with this team and really push them over the edge to where they become that dominant team in the AFC during the 1970s. So Terry Bradshaw and Terry Hanratty, believe it or not, these guys split time. Chuck Noll, never really happy with Terry Bradshaw, especially early in his career. Would pull him out of games and replace him with Hanratty. Bradshaw early on was kind of a run and gun, gunslinger kind of quarterback, threw a lot of interceptions and got himself in trouble, which drove Chuck Noll nuts. And so he would bring in Terry Hanratty. Halfbacks, Preston Pearson, who would spend a good chunk of his career after this with the Dallas Cowboys at halfback. Johnny Frenchie Fuqua as your fullback, known primarily as the guy Terry Bradshaw was throwing to during the championship game against, was it a championship game or a divisional game against the Raiders, where Bradshaw lobbed a Hail Mary pass to Fuqua, who was hit immediately when the ball ended up in his hands by Jack Tatum of the Raiders. The ball bounced up in the air and was caught by Franco Harris and ran in for a touchdown. Again, he was part of that immaculate reception. He was also a player that was known to have platform shoes that had live goldfish in the soles and heels. He was known as being a very fancy dresser in the 70s. Dennis Hughes is your starting tight end. The wide receiving core, they had some good receivers prior to Swan and Stallworth, and Dave Smith and Ron Shanklin. The offensive line, Haggerty, Davis, Ray Mansfield, Van Dyke, and Brown. And now we're seeing the kind of the beginning of the steel curtain with Voss, Mean Joe Green, Hinton, and then, of course, L.C. Greenwood coming in. He was a young player at that time, but he will be in the lineup sooner rather than later. Your linebackers. This is before Jack Ham and Jack Lambert. So you had Hildebrandt, Andy Russell, who was a fine linebacker for the Steelers during their early Super Bowl runs. The veteran Chuck Allen, still going strong. The defensive backs, Calland, Austin, Beatty, and the great Mel Blount. The kicker was Gene Mingo. Bobby Walden, the punter. You have Blount and Staggers doing kick returns, and Bryant and Staggers handling the punt return duties. And that wraps up the Central. And now we're at the Western Division in the AFC. The Broncos will be at War Memorial Stadium, also known as the Rock Pile, in Buffalo in Week 1. Pete Liskey is your starting quarterback. The Broncos had high hopes in this season that they were going to be competitive and basically have a good chance of winning the AFC West. They were pretty much let down by their quarterbacking, I would have to say. Floyd Little is your halfback, the great Floyd Little. And who knows where this Denver offense would be without Floyd Little. Bobby Anderson is your starting fullback. Whalen is your starting tight end. And then wide receiving core, solid to good. Hafner, Embry, Denson, and Billy Van Heusen, who, again, was one of these guys that did double duty. He was a receiver and handled the punting duties. The offensive line, Brunelli, Godek, Kaminsky, Young, and Current. The defensive line, the Orange Crush defense. Prior to Lyle Zato being drafted, you had Rich Tombstone Jackson at defensive left end, Paul Smith, Dave Costa, outstanding player, and Pete Durenko. So that starting four gave opposing teams nightmares. Just especially Rich Jackson, who is known just as a great pass rusher, and get a name like Tombstone for nothing, I guess. The linebacking core, Cunningham, Washington, and Forsberg. Your defensive backs, Gordon, Martha, Greer, and Billy Thompson. Bobby Howfield handled the kicking duties. Again, Billy Van Heusen, wide receiver and punter. Handling kick return duties, Anderson and Thompson, and then Thompson and Floyd Little with the punt return. Kansas City, they will be doing their Super Bowl rematch up in Minnesota in Metropolitan Stadium. And the Chiefs won the Super Bowl in '69, so they're just a year off of that. But this is they were very competitive at times, but you start to see the trend is they are starting in decline. They would still be competitive for a few more years, and then they would just go kind of into the wilderness and not be a very good team for several years in the 1970s. They still had the great Lenny Dawson at quarterback. Ed Podolak is your halfback, with Warren McVeigh, who shared duties with him. The burly Wendell Hayes as your fullback, along with Robert Holmes. Your tight ends, Fred Arbanas, Heisman Trophy winner back in, I want to say like 1960, Billy Cannon, who was the first big name signed by the American Football League. He was playing for the Houston Oilers that won the those AFL championships in the early 60s. Ended up playing a little bit with the Raiders, and then wrapped up his career here with with the Chiefs. Morris Stroud, the towering tight end, especially in his day, he was just a very, very big guy. He was a head taller than most of the offensive linemen when you see them in their choir box huddle, which was unique to them at that time, is when they would break, Morris Stroud was easily a head, if not a head and a neck above everybody else from a height perspective. Your wide receivers are going to be Pitts, the great Otis Taylor, still going strong at 28. Gloucester Richardson was another wide receiver that was really good, that was used quite a bit as well. The offensive line, Tyrer, Bud, Rudney, Mormon, and Hill. The defensive line, some big names here. Jerry Mays, the veteran. Curly Culp, the young and upcoming nose guard tackle. The great Buck Buchanan. And then Aaron Brown. Buck Buchanan was just a phenomenally talented athlete and just a dominating defensive lineman in his day. The linebackers, a very, very solid group. Bobby Bell, again, fantastic player in his day. Jim Lynch and the great Willie Lanier. Willie Lanier is known to be the first African American to start as a middle linebacker for a professional football team. The middle linebacker was considered to be the quarterback of the defense. And Willie Lanier was the first African American to start and excel in that position. Had a very long, illustrious career with the Chiefs. Your defensive backs, a good defensive backfield with Marsalis, Johnny Robinson, Kearney, and Emmett Thomas. The kicker, Jan Stenerud, punter Gerald Wilson, and your kick returners are Holmes and Podolak. Your punt returner, Podolak or Willie Mitchell. The Oakland Raiders will be at Cincinnati. So the Raiders were, well, they're the Raiders. Tough, hard-nosed, borderline, dirty players. They had that Raider mystique back in the 70s for sure, as the kind of the outlaws and the just, you know, all the bad dudes ended up with the Raiders, and they relished and just really reveled in their notoriety of, you know, being that kind of, you know, nasty team. At this point, Daryl LaMonica, the Mad Bomber, is your starting quarterback, and he would give way from time to time to the at this time considered to be at age 43, the geriatric George Blanda. And also third string at this time was Ken Stabler, but he didn't get much playing time, so LaMonica was the clear starter, and then Blanda was brought in when John Madden wanted to change things up or needed a victory pulled out of the jaws of defeat. He led several come-from-behind wins for the Raiders that year. Your halfbacks, Smith and Banaszak. Your fullbacks, Dixon and Hubbard. The rookie Raymond Chester started at tight end. At wide receiver, and of course, if this is the classic Raider teams of the vertical game, Al Davis was big on speed and strong arm quarterbacks. They loved the bomb, so they had wide receivers that could fit within that philosophy with Warren Wells, who was a real burner in his day. Fred Biletnikoff, not quite as fast, but hard-nosed and ran good routes, but still fantastic wide receiver. So great wide receiving core and deep, as you can see. The offensive line, really good. Shell, Upshaw, Otto, Harvey, and Such. The defensive line, Klein, Oates, Keating, and Ben Davidson. He of the handlebar mustache and the notoriety of hitting people after the play was over. I think somebody said that he would probably hit people after the game was over. Kind of a villainous character during his career. Ended up going into doing some movies, and was in the first Conan the Barbarian movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Linebackers, Lasky, Gus Ottos, Dan Connors, and then the young Gerald Irons, who would later become a mainstay with the Raiders for years in the 70s. The defensive backs, got some good ones here. McClellan, Dave Grayson, George Atkinson, and Willie Brown. I believe George Atkinson, his nickname was Dr. Death. Somebody could, in the comments if they want to correct me on that, but he was a hard hitter, and Willie Brown was probably like as close to a gold standard as you could get when it came to a defensive back or a cornerback. Your kicker, George Blanda. Your punter, Mike Eischeid. Kick returners were Atkinson and Wyatt. And your punt returners were Wyatt and Rod Sherman. And lastly, San Diego. The Chargers are going to be hosting Baltimore. And this is a Charger team, again, a lot of famous names from the old AFL are still around on the roster, but they're a team that is in decline. So they were very up and down during the 70s season. John Hadel is your quarterback. Dickie Post and Mike Garrett as your halfbacks. Fullback would be Jeff Queen. Willie Frazier was the starting tight end, and a very good tight end. And then we get into the famous names. Lance Allworth. What can be said about Lance Allworth and his career, especially during the AFL? He was, for the decade of the 60s, was considered the gold standard of wide receiver, both in the NFL and the AFL. He may have been the best receiver in football for a decade. Just amazing. If you ever watch any old replays of the early 70s or even in the 60s, if you can find it, tremendous wide receiver. He was his running mate on the San Diego offense was Gary the Ghost Garrison. The offensive line: Owens, Lankaitis, Gruenson, Sweeney, Russ Washington, and Russ Washington would be a mainstay along with Sweeney for the Chargers for years going in the 70s. Russ Washington was still around and playing right tackle with the Air Coryell Chargers. Your defensive line, this is where they kind of start to fall apart a little bit, as really had a hard time stopping people. Owens, Briggs, Bingsley, and DeLong. Your linebackers: Staggs, Barnes, Babbage, and Redmond. And as you can tell, ratings-wise, this was a pretty porous defense. Defensive backs: Howard, Tolbert, Hill, Beaucamp. Handling the kicking duties, Mike Mercer. Dennis Partee is your punter. Les Speedy Duncan is your kick returner, along with Chris Fletcher. And then Fletcher and Smith handling your punt returns. All right, so that wraps up kind of an overview of the teams for 1970. I'll be simming week 1 in a separate video, and we'll just sim every week and get all the way through to the Super Bowl, and then after that we'll just compare records and stats and winners for the postseason with real life. So thanks for watching the video, and please put some comments below if you liked it. Appreciate you taking the time to watch.